Hello YouTube and welcome to Kharak's SMGs. It's a new series I'm doing on what I essentially call ships of maximum goofiness. That is to say that they're not builds that are generally seen often, but they are very funny when you come across them, and they are semi-practical, i.e. they aren't really good at combat, and you're not going to probably expect this in an elite TFO to do very well, though it still can. But it's generally not for max DPS or actually having a meta build, it's just for fun. This one is what I call a summoner build, so it focuses in a very specific subset of summoner. Rather than maximizing the amount of objects in space, this is a fleet summoner, so it focuses on ships and movable objects that are not like self-sacrificing like torpedoes, for example. Anyway, let's get into the actual build. So here's the display. Currently, as you can see, a lot of it's universal consoles, and I did base this off of a different summoner build that focused mainly on Odyssey spamming, and I'll put that on screen right now. Generally speaking, this focuses much more on just general ship count, so it's not going to be specifically Dominion or otherwise like suited to one faction in particular. This is just a broad range of ships from wherever that just seem relevant to maximizing the amount of mobile units you can have on a field that may or may not be relevant. So the first place I should start is with the actual ship. So there's two types of ships that I'll show. I'll get to the second, more practical version. This is a max heavy ship build, and what this does is focus on spamming as many big, intimidating ships as possible. It's not really as practical as a result, but it is very fun to throw a lot of big ships at the enemy, because you may ask with what fleet, and then you just pulled this out. So the reason I'm using a Talaru Intel Carrier Warbird is because it has the necessary triggers to do the two things that a summoner has to do in order to get the most amount of summons possible. The first is that you have to emphasize the amount of consoles you have that are either geared towards assisting your fleet or otherwise spawning more ships in said fleet. The second is that you want anything that helps you reduce the cooldowns of said abilities to basically get as many of them out as possible. So, with that said, let's go over the consoles. So, the biggest three here are these. The Universal Gemini device summons 2 copies of the Enterprise. It is very good in my opinion. Tends to be one of the easiest ones to use for a mobile build, since they are very fast and they can do a lot of damage. The second and third are the Enhanced Mannheim device and the Temporal Disorder. Similar to the Odyssey build that I mentioned, this summons, if you combine the two, 6 duplicates, 2 in front and behind, if I activate the Mannheim device, like so, and then 4 with Temporal Disorder diagonally, like so. Sometimes it's a bit random. So in this case, this summons a bunch of ships that will shoot for you and do a lot of damage, okay, maybe not a ton of damage, but it adds up. But these are the biggest ships in the fleet that tend to emphasize the most bang for their buck in terms of like size to power ratio. So moving forward with that, we have the Athen Prime Fleet Museum Beacon. I like this one because it actually gives a lot of other bonuses, but the hero ship can definitely help a lot, so it adds another ship to the fleet. I actually do use the Alliance Squadron beacon because this isn't a Dominion vessel, so it doesn't benefit from the like commands that you can normally give. But having 4 additional ships always tends to be funny, especially since they follow you around, which they're fast enough to keep up, similar to the Enterprises that I forgot to demonstrate. Fantastic. Okay, what else am I using? So I also have, yes, this one. The Subspace Fracture Tunneling Field. This one I'm using mostly because the reduced recharge time of Universal Console's abilities by 25%. That's a pretty big reduction, so more of these. For example, I'll just, normally this would take, like, okay, anyway, moving on. Alright, the next consoles that I'm using, Swarmer Matrix, Scatter Pack and Weasels, and, Defensive Drone Guardians. These are all, smaller craft focused, but they're mostly meant to, supplement the, shuttlecraft I have here. And I'm using these shuttlecraft mostly because, since I don't do very much damage to begin with, having the ability to debuff damage resistance is going to be very helpful for the rest of my fleet to do any actual damage. So, the Swarmer Matrix is mostly to buff said shuttles into the ground. The Scatter Pack just tends to launch more shuttles, but on top of being distractions, they can actually do a lot of damage, which, as you can notice, this build doesn't really have very many torpedoes. So, like, fleet-wise, most of these are going to be summoning beam-related ships, and the only ones that are torpedo-based are mostly the Cardassian torp platform, this Dominion summon, which has torpedoes, and then the Wild Weasels in particular, or sorry, not Wild Weasel, the Scatter Pack launches kinetic-based munitions at a target. So those tend to be how I get to do reasonable damage through shields, since the rest use either only guns or cannons or beams. But yes, when you pair all of these together, it basically allows you to throw out as many small craft as possible that are either useful for defending yourself or just in general doing damage, since the Scatter Packs, for example, have a very short cooldown in comparison to most of their competitors. Anyway, but yes, so those are all the consoles, minus this one, which is just used for mostly buffing the fleet's fire rate on top of giving them additional damage through overload, since most of my builds, or fleets in this case, won't actually use fire will. Some do, but not all of them. And in this case, what I use to supplement this is typically, as you can see in the order down here, I have fleet support as well, and I can additionally summon either additional Type 14 shuttles, since those have engineering teams and could be useful, or the Herc as a backup, since, I mean, if you want a summon build, you can't not talk about the Herc. So, alright, now that I've mentioned all of the consoles I'm using and the devices, now let's move on to the traits. As far as skills are concerned, the only thing that matters, I made a non-meta build that's meant to at least somewhat questionably survive, and to some extent maximize the amount of like skill recharge I have on abilities that tend to spam the most. My only emphasis is coordination protocols, since those really buff your hangar pets by a ton. I also did the same for the choice selection for the craft health and damage. Anyway, now for the traits. The biggest one for personal is going to be Boimler effect. I don't know why I said Beimler. And unconventional systems. The reason why is probably self-evident. Unconventional systems control bridge officer ability, recharge to universal console. So the reason I chose the Talaru in particular is because, similar to the Arc Royal I will show you later, this build has both intel and temporal, and not only that, but it also beats the Arc Royal because you can have more science abilities and you can also throw engineering in there when you normally can't. So in this case, this actually maximizes the amount of unconventional systems triggers to basically make it very quick to put out even more ships. And one of the fascinating features about this is that where the Lost Arena photonic ambush, in this case, I think I forgot to show that console, but yes, the fundamental field replicator. This is the only exception to not being reduced by the system triggers because it already reduces bridge officer ability recharge, so that's unfortunate. But it was too good of a console to pass down since 9 summons is, well, 9 summons. But in this case, this basically maximizes the amount of time recharge it takes. I mostly emphasize basically ionic turbulence as being one of the easier ways to survive, since it essentially helps with dealing damage and additionally making sure enemies won't be able to touch you so easily if you use chronometric inversion field with it. But all of these others are very important. It's mostly science abilities and obviously intel temporal that trigger it, but also I do have emit unstable warp bubble, which also helps keep you alive if you're getting into really dangerous scuffles at close range. So now that I've mentioned the traits, or the stations, let me move to the traits. So now that I've mentioned unconventional systems and the Boimler effect, which in this case it's just to reduce the cooldowns of all of these abilities so that the recharge is even faster. The other ones I'm using are, I'm using the 2 photonic ones. So having photonic summon a 4th ship and reducing its cooldown so that it triggers much faster. You're going to be spamming abilities anyway, so you don't have to worry about like when you're going to use this every 10 seconds. You're going to be triggering it all the time anyway. But anyway, other ones I'm using independent wingmate, so I'm getting extra damage from that. I have hive defenses, so that every time I'm hit, I summon more Herc. That one's really fun to mess with. I have friends in unusual places. Reduces my distress calls and fleet support, both of which summon a ship. I'll get to that in the starship traits. Enhance and protect. I'm using this mostly because I'm activating my captain abilities anyway. You'll see why in that case. But yes, all of the pets, nearly all of the pets, gaining this stat buff tends to just be useful to me anyway. So, like, there's no reason for me not to. And then I have advanced rapid support since my career ability does summon a ship. So, and then Wing Commander because, well, it's Wing Commander. It helps my hangar pets do more damage over time as they upgrade. Okay, now for the starship traits. What I'm currently using is a lot. These might be hard to get depending on how you do it, but I'm using formation flying from that 1 synth ship. It summons 2 synth every time I use a distress call ability, so in this case fleet support does it. My shuttle support squadrons and the Herc also summon it, so that's very neat. It just helps add more ships to the fleet, and since they're destroyers, they're at least somewhat more powerful than a shuttle, theoretically. I'm using improved command frequency because I'm too lazy to get the elite one, which would essentially add an additional frigate to it. But in this case, it allowing me to essentially use fleet support much more often since it summons a big ship is really nice. It's another enterprise. I really recommend this because it allows you to use Science Fleet and summon the flagship. So that's another summon. Not to mention, if you pair it with Science, obviously the reason you're using Science for this kind of build is for the Photonic Fleet. But, so, like, for example, the other traits I'm using, Need to Know Basis, you're spamming all of these abilities to trigger the Boimler effect anyway. So this will just summon by itself. You'll get a Section 31 Interdictor, which is nice. Photonic Diversion. Since Jam Sensors is a control ability, and that counts towards the unconventional systems, this allowing you to summon a duplicate of yourself nearby and shoot. That's very helpful. Adds another ship. Repurposed Cargo Bay. This is obviously nice because it allows me to summon fighters, which in this case, now that they have photon torpedoes, it supplements my dire lack of them. So even more summons. And my last one that I'm using, as odd as it sounds, is from the Noble Intel Battlecruiser that just came out. It's called To Hell With Our Orders, because in this case, it actually adds additional recharge time, or removes time from the Universal Consoles. Not as powerful as unconventional systems, but the fact is that you can pair that with just additional... It'll essentially give you additional cooldown to immediately spam more stuff as fast as possible. And before I had the synth destroyers, I did use I think this is from the Kayatan, I might be wrong, or Acacian, I always say it wrong, but this, every time you launch, it may reduce the time on captain abilities, so it's sort of a self buff, in a sense. I reduce the recharge times to reduce the recharge times, though they're not directly buffing themselves. But yeah, so those tend to all be very nice. You can kind of see how they all stack up to do their thing. And as far as space rep goes, I'm mostly using just to sort of help supplement my slightly poor power levels in everything. Just having Aux power give me additional health and damage. It's not perfect because normally I'd have more Aux power on this. This is why I have the Aux to essentially buff it occasionally. But it sort of just helps in general. Could probably be more optimized. The bonus exotic damage, this is more for my Arc Royal build, which you'll see in a second. And then the last one I have, or last two abilities, is this Chrono Capacitor from the Temporal for ability recharge, because why not? And then just overall increased damage resistance from the Advanced Hull Reinforcement, just to make things easier. As for space rep, I just chose whatever was funny. The only exception is these two. Even though they're like stationary platforms, they tend to just be useful for buffing the summons, since some of them don't typically move very fast. So that just helps. The rest I just crammed with whatever I thought would be funny. So, anyway. So that's the general build. As far as using a Talaru, the only other thing I would recommend is that, the Terran Task Force Quantum Capacitor Singularity Core. The reason I'm using this is because it increases the charge rate of the Singularity by 20%. And the reason I'm using it is mostly for Warp Shadow. So essentially, once I get this to level 5 max charge, I can summon 5 duplicates to add to the 6 duplicates that I'm already summoning from the Mannheim and the Temporal Disorder. They're not very good, granted, but they do actually help make sure, especially in elite TFOs, that you don't die very quickly, because you're going to be essentially having a bunch of distractions fighting for you. So the general aim to survive in elite TFOs in this case is essentially to just summon as many allies as possible and hope that they get hit instead of you, because at the end of the day, in a sense, if the AI never shoots at you, well, all of your ships in the fleet now become a sort of tank in and of itself, which, as you can probably tell, these individually may not do a ton of damage, but they do have a lot of hit points, which makes it actually somewhat practical for tanking. Anyway, before we move on to the Ark Royal, it's demonstration time. I'll test it in a elite TFO for reasons.
Your assistance in taking down the crystalline entity is most appreciated. I fear we do not have much time at our disposal. I can bring you...
Alright, this is the second version. This is the Ark Royal version. As you can see, it's slightly different. For example, the Lost Arenas console is instead replaced by the Cardassian support platform cluster. While this is also stationary, there is the fact that it gives shield regeneration and also like debuffs enemies near it, on top of also being, unlike the Lost Serena console, being affected by the cooldowns. So it helps a lot in the fact that you can place it and basically wherever you go it'll follow. In this case, with the stations, we have where it's missing a few abilities because it's mostly put more towards tactical now and engineering can't use its warp bubble. But at least in this case, it still has most of the fundamentals. It still has the chronometric ionic combo. And in this case, since it has a secondary deflector, I'm going with inhibiting instead of deteriorating. Because in this case, all of our system triggers has to do with control-related abilities. So if I went full deteriorating, which would be more DPS, it would be at the downside that I basically never trigger it. Except if I sacrificed for the summons, which is a problem. So in this case, the obvious difference is that it'll get some pretty decent DPS, because not only do the weapons have enough power, but the Ox also has a ton of power. So in this case, you'll get quite a bit of damage from the secondary deflector, especially on elite TFOs where it can really actually do that damage. But otherwise, it's sort of just an additional bonus to have along with. The other is that this is still using my original strategy of the relaunch and repair, with to hell with our orders. So it focuses a lot more on spamming the abilities you already have, because especially for ones like Temporal Disorder and I think the Gemini, the Athen as well. All three of those will actually summon additional copies of itself without removing the previous ones. The Mannheim, you can't do that because it's on a it actually has a cooldown 30 seconds. While it has, the best way to put it is that its cooldown is actively tracked. So if I click this again, it'll not do anything. I can't reduce it while that's running at all. So you can't do it for that, even if you can do it for Temporal Disorder. Science Fleet obviously is pretty nice still, but the real kicker is in the fact that every time you launch fighters, these captain abilities are going to get reduced, which will then reduce the universal consoles so that you can spam more temporal and enterprises. Which, out of all of these summons, I would say the Enterprise is actually arguably the best one, especially since the console doesn't take too long to recharge for what it's worth. So, anyway, now we'll demonstrate what this build looks like in combat by means of elite TFO. And that's all I have for this fleet build. So, if you want more, there will be more anyway, but I'll keep making more videos about just ship types in general that seem to be questionable, but they seem to work well enough and they're funny to mess with. So, that's all I have for now, so yeah. Funny.